The question of separation is a profound question, especially at this moment in history. There are many forms of separation. There's complete separation, there's partial separation, there's physical separation, there is cultural, spiritual, and ideological separation. So although I don't have enough time to explore all of the forms of separation that are possible, especially for us, a nation within a nation.
That's right.
A people oppressed within the most powerful and richest nation that humanity has known. $20 trillion economy, the most powerful military that humanity has ever known. This is where we are. But we are a part of humanity. And I'm certain that none of us would call for us to be separated from humanity's dark and colored majorities of the world. We don't want to be separated from India and Africa and China. That would be suicidal. So even as we would separate spiritually and ideologically from the oppressor nation and the exploiting classes, that separation gives us the opportunity to unite ourselves with that from which we have come and that which constitutes our future. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad was prescient and brilliant when he defined us as Asiatic black people. A synthesis, something new, and something that represents the future. Our unity with humanity's majority means that we join with them in bringing about and helping to achieve the inevitable and ultimate collapse of Europe and European civilization and the rise of the future, the Afro-Asiatic civilization. But we are faced with an oppressor who will not leave the stage of history and separate himself from humanity. Will not leave the stage of history willingly or peacefully. Right. Just yesterday, we dodged the bullet of another war. Even though they say they want war with Iran, a Muslim nation, let us not forget that all of the wars of this century waged by this government have been against dark nations and Muslim nations.
That's right. That's right.
Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, estimated $7 trillion spent, over 500,000 people killed. Let me just say this quickly, they don't want Iran. War with Iran would mean the price of oil would go up to $200 a barrel, at the pump $10 a gallon. world economy would be thrown into a depression from which the United States would not recover, throwing this country into the depth of a crisis the likes of which it has never seen. And rather than the white majority having the luxury, which they have had for most of the history of this country, to turn on us and blame us, they will turn on each other. It will be the end of the regime of oppression and white supremacy, and hopefully the beginning of an era of freedom. Thank you very much.
Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast. This week, Ken sits down to speak with legendary investigative journalist Gareth Porter to discuss his chapter in the recent anthology published by Haymarket Books titled The United States, Southeast Asia, and Historical Memory, edited by Mark Pavlick and Caroline Luft.
It is a pleasure to have you on the Washington Babylon podcast. We're going to talk about a number of things, including a chapter you wrote for a really great book called The United States, Southeast Asia, and Historical Memory, which is edited by Mark Pavlick and Caroline Luft. And they're going to be doing an interview for the website over the next couple of days. So I'm excited about that too. Before we get going, though, because I want to talk to you about your chapter just to kick off the conversation, but just tell, I think most of our listeners will be familiar with you, but give us a little background about, just give us your nutshell bio and let us know what you're up to now.
Sure. I'm an investigative journalist, independent investigative journalist. Began this phase of my life 15 years ago, roughly, in the early phase of the Iraq War, after having finished a book published by University of California Press on how the United States and why the United States went to war in Vietnam, which has not been popular among diplomatic historians, but has a certain following among people who care about the issue of U.S. Global interventionism. And that's because it made the case that there was never a balance of power during the key phase of the Cold War from the early 50s to the late 70s, but rather U.S. domination militarily over this Soviet Union and China, which really caused the United States to blunder into Vietnam through overconfidence. That was the nutshell summary of my thesis. So I was coming off a book that was really a good experience intellectually for me, because I learned from that the danger of how the national security state could really push a president, in fact, two presidents, both Kennedy and Johnson, into war, despite the fact that they were both extremely skeptical and even resistant to going to war in Vietnam. So that's really where I'm coming from, and that has infused my coverage of the Iraq War, the U.S. engagement over Iran, the threat of war with Iran, the whole nuclear issue with Iran, Afghanistan, which I've written about extensively, Pakistan, and Syria.
Well, that's all quite interesting, and these are all topics of great interest to me, so I know we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. Let me ask you something about the chapter in the book. Your chapter is titled My Lai and the American Way of War Crimes, and I want to just have you broadly lay out what the chapter's about to summarize it for us, but I want to make sure to ask you one thing that's related to My Lai, which is that Seymour Hersh, one of the greatest investigative reporters of modern times, if not the greatest, uncovered My Lai. Yes. And yet now, Cy Hersh, and I've got to call him and ask him about this, and I hope he'll come on the podcast. But as far as I can tell, he can't publish in the United States, or it's very difficult for him to publish. And I believe it's because his views have just become too unacceptable to mainstream opinion as defined by his editor at the New Yorker, David Remnick, and other editors. But I want you first just to discuss your chapter, The American Way of War Crimes, and then I would like you to comment on Cy Hirsch and what are your thoughts about his career, and why aren't we hearing more from him now?
Right. So the chapter about My Lai and the American Way of War Crimes is about the fundamental misunderstanding, which has been perpetuated for so many decades now, a little bit more than 5 decades since My Lai became public, about the nature of what happened there. Why did it happen? I think that almost everyone, with very few exceptions, believes that My Lai was the result of a relatively small number of people who were violating the policy laid out by the command. Now, obviously, there are people who didn't believe that, but I think that is the predominant view by far of why My Lai, the My Lai massacre happened. And what I found in investigating the investigation of My Lai by the commission that was set up to do the investigation in the U.S. Army is that there was, in fact, a serious cover-up of the My Lai massacre, and that what actually happened was that the command under General William C. Westmoreland, had made it clear through various means, without explicitly giving a directive to that effect, that the population that was living in those districts and communities that were under long-term control by the Viet Cong, by the communist forces in South Vietnam, were to be considered to have no rights as civilians. They were to be considered instead the equivalent of military personnel and could be treated as such. Mm-hmm. And that's why bombing campaigns were carried out against these areas, these zones that were under the control of the Viet Cong. And that's why the people who were carrying out the massacre that day, the captains who were in charge of the units, the companies that carried them out, were told, they testified before courts that they were told that there would be nothing but enemy troops in the village. And when they found no enemy troops, they went ahead with disposing of them, with killing the civilians that they found. Now, that makes it no less a war crime that soldiers are responsible for, but what it means is that there was command responsibility all the way to the top, William C. Westmoreland. Mm-hmm. So that's what I call the American way of war crimes, that was covered up by the Peers Commission. General Peers, who was in charge of that commission, deliberately covered that up. And I found from an interview with his civilian advisor during that Peers Commission investigation, that what Peers had hoped was that by not revealing Westmoreland's responsibility, that Westmoreland would, after the commission report came out, would give him a plum assignment as commander of the U.S. forces in South Korea. Well, that never happened, but that was what he had hoped. And that was the reason, that was his motivation for carrying out that cover-up.
It's really quite extraordinary. I mean, I don't know who, deserves to rot in hell more, the people who carried out the war crimes or a man who sought to promote his own career by covering them up. I mean, that's a hard choice.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yeah. Well, could you just talk quickly about Cy Hirsch?
Yes.
And
Well, I again, I agree with you that clearly what has happened here is that Cy Hirsch, who was really honored, excuse me, he was honored as an investigative journalist for decades, has become persona non grata within the establishment media complex. And that reaches very far, obviously, all the way to the London Review of Books, it appears, because LRB now won't publish him either. And I think the reason is precisely because he has taken a position that was unacceptable to the corporate media complex. And there is such uniformity in the line taken within that complex that you can understand how this could easily happen. And Cy Hirsch, had his status because he came from the New York Times, because he had that cachet as someone who had been in a corporate media position, and was, in good odor in that regard. And therefore, I think he could do the investigation of My Lai. He could do other investigations, and get a great deal of honor and credit for that. But I think that position that he took, the coverage that he gave to the Syrian chemical weapons issue was the breaking point, and was regarded as putting him into a category of unacceptable journalists.
And can you talk about that a little? I mean, what did Cy, I'm pretty familiar with what he reported and believed, but can you lay out his case? What made him unacceptable specifically?
Well, he wrote a piece for the London Review of Books, and of course it was not accepted by the New Yorker for the reasons that we've just been discussing. But his piece for the London Review of Books laid out a scenario, or an explanation, I should say, for what happened surrounding the Khan Sheikhoun affair, the alleged chemical weapons attack in Khan Sheikhoun by the Assad government, that suggested that there was, in fact, an understanding or communication between the Russian government and the U.S. government about an airstrike that would be taking place in Khan Sheikhoun, not a Russian airstrike, but a Syrian airstrike that was clearly supported by the Russians, had been cleared with the Russians, and that it was in fact an airstrike that related to an Al-Qaeda, or certainly suspected Al-Qaeda meeting that was to take place that morning. Now, what he was suggesting was that the airstrike also hit an ammunition, not an ammunition, but a dump or collection of weapons that went off because of the airstrike. And I think that's what was found to be unacceptable. Now, I have written, to be very clear about this, I have written a piece on the same subject, which began with looking at the Cy Hirsch piece, and then did further investigation on it, in which I determined that what actually happened was that, yes, there was the airstrike. It was carried out, as Cy Hirsch reported, on a building that could have been the suspected location of a meeting, which involved somebody that they were considering to be suspected Al-Qaeda. But I believe that it was, in fact, the location where the person in charge of relocation of refugees from Hama province, south of Idlib province, where this Khan Sheikhoun is located, actually lived, and that he would have been obviously in charge of supplies of fertilizer that could have caused the damage and death to people that has been attributed to a sarin gas attack, but which I believe there's strong evidence was not sarin, but rather the consequences of a phosphate-based chemical that exploded, was burned and went into the air, and could cause the same set of physical characteristics that were associated with a sarin attack. So I have a great deal of in-depth documentation to support this. Of course, it's been rejected by everyone who supports the U.S. policy of supporting the opposition. But nevertheless, that's what I found in my own investigation.
Well, so I'm clear on this, and so listeners are clear, it sounds like, and maybe I missed something, that you're not agreeing 100% with Cy Hirsch's interpretation. However, you are challenging the official account in the same way, or not precisely the same way, but in a similar manner. And
that's correct. Yes, I have some significant differences with the account that Cy gave, which was based on his sources who were in touch with the Russians, and I think the sources accurately portrayed what they were being told.
Right.
So there are differences there, and by the way, I am not suggesting that the Russians and the Syrian government should be considered innocent. I think that they could have and should have realized that attack could have caused the kinds of physical damage and death that it did cause. So there is a question mark there that needs to be seriously considered or investigated. But I do think that the idea that there was a sarin attack is incorrect, and I think that there was a cover-up by Al-Qaeda, which was the local government in Khan Sheikhoun, to make it look like it was a sarin attack, which is a more complicated problem to unpack, but I think there's evidence to that effect.
Very interesting, and definitely not a point of view one would hear in our media, where it doesn't surprise me at all that your work or that Cy's work, whether one of you are right or both of you are right, you're both serious investigators, and the evidence should be at least considered. But it's, as so frequently happens in this country, anything that challenges, I mean, on domestic policy, there's a debate in this country in some way, in the media, and you have differences between Democrats and Republicans on social policies, obviously, and those divisions are, I believe, because fundamentally the media is a reflection of our, for lack of a better term, ruling class. So when there are splits in the ruling class, then those splits are seen in the media. But when it comes,
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and when it comes to foreign policy, though, because both sides are so united in this preposterous idea that the United States is special. I forget the term that always incenses me. Obama used it repeatedly, like every past president. And Trump, curiously, and we'll talk about Trump's foreign policy in a little while, doesn't use that phrase so much. And in fact, he's sort of rejected it. But, I'm blanking on the term, but it's like, America's special place in the world.
Exceptionalism, I suppose.
American exceptionalism, exactly.
Yeah.
So anything that challenges that idea, which is so ludicrous. I mean, every power in the world, great and small, has a foreign policy that is designed to enhance its own economic and geostrategic interest. I mean, a kindergartner can understand that. But for our media, it's, we alone among all empires are different and better. It's actually quite pathetic.
Well, so, I suppose one could argue that exceptionalism does have a certain accuracy to it sense that the United States is exceptional in the degree to which it has taken on the role of hegemony throughout the world, beyond any previous empire. And exceptionalism does, in fact, accurately describe the degree to which the United States takes it, believes that it has the right to do things that nobody else in the world has the right to do. I think that's true. There is exceptionalism in that. It does accurately describe something that exists in the political culture of the United States. It's not really exactly what it purports to be, however.
Yes, I agree with you. And I believe also that another American exceptionalism is the incredible naivete, stupidity, and lack of knowledge on the part of 95% of our press corps. I mean, it's pathetic. You can read things in the newspaper that are demonstrably false and yet go unchallenged because reporters are too lazy, corrupt, or stupid to challenge anything that the government says, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. And in that sense, I think we have an exceptionally stupid news media. Anyway, let's move on because we've only got about another 10 minutes, but maybe we'll have you back on a little bit down the road and we can talk more on the topic of the US media. But for now, let's go back to a little bit more about your book or the chapter in the book. Again, it's called The United States, Southeast Asian Historical Memory, edited by Mark Pavlick and Caroline Luft. You've got a really interesting chapter in there. But let's talk a little bit about U.S. war crimes in Indochina generally, and what happened as a result. I mean, what I read about Indochina now, or Southeast Asia, and like Latin America, to read it in the U.S. media and to hear it from the U.S. government, these countries are just completely backward and hopelessly corrupt, and you'd never actually know that the United States had an extraordinary role in screwing up these countries, and I'm putting that as politely as possible. So what was the long-term result of U.S. policy in Indochina from the 1960s, and a policy that included that included flagrant, unpunished war crimes?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and it's certainly not given enough attention, if any attention, really, by either historians or contemporary observers, because the fact is that it was not just long-term, but even in the short term, and especially in the short term, I would argue, the way in which the U.S. military pulverized the three societies of Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, as well as, to some extent, not so much directly, but indirectly through the Thai government, Thailand itself. Mm-hmm. The United States managed to destabilize an entire region of the world, that is to say, mainland Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. That region, contrary to the general understanding that has surrounded the Vietnam War, which was that, well, this was a region in terrible turmoil that was threatened by communist takeover if the United States had not intervened. On the contrary, it was really quite stable and peaceful in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Mm-hmm. In fact, I have argued in print and will continue to argue that had it not been for the U.S. wars in Indochina, in all three of those countries, because the United States did not occupy for long periods of time, of course, Laos or Cambodia, but it did carry out huge, horrible campaigns of bombing, not just a pinpoint, not pinpoint bombing of military sites, but bombing of entire regions which were considered to be occupied by the enemy, by the excuse me, the Pathet Lao in Laos, and of course the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, they completely pulverized those societies. And in the case of Cambodia, they essentially laid the groundwork to get rid of the Sihanouk government, which had been able to maintain peace in the country, and to give the Khmer Rouge a new lease on life. They had been basically a meaningless, a powerless small group up to the time that the war in Vietnam began, and they became a powerful military force because of the U.S. war in Cambodia. And the result that we saw in Cambodia, which was the terrible crimes that the Khmer Rouge committed after the war, starting during, but basically after the war, are the result of the war in Vietnam. And it's a more complicated story, which I could tell, but I know we don't have the time to do that. But this is an extremely important point because it has not been understood in the way that it needs to be understood, that the United States did the same thing in Southeast Asia in the 1960s and early 70s that it has done in the Middle East, beginning with, of course, the invasion of Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Well, we do have time constraints, which is unfortunate, but that is all quite interesting. And again, it's the sort of information that you just typically don't hear and that few people understand. We're raising generations of Americans who have no idea of what their own history is, which is a very dangerous situation.
Right, and this simply underlines the nature of the problem. It's a systemic problem. This is now the second time around for the United States to do this. And so it should raise the most fundamental questions about, why we keep this system in being. Well, I mean, the reason is obvious. It's, that the people who run it are so powerful politically. But nevertheless, the issue needs to be raised much more vehemently and clearly.
I want to ask you one question. I'm going to have to really make you be quick on this one because I have two questions left and we're running out of time. But
Sure.
I did want to ask you about the domino theory, which was bandied about forever as the rationale for why the U.S. had to go to war in Vietnam, because if Vietnam fell, the rest of the region would fall to the Reds. And I wanted to ask you if, is that true? If the U.S. had not gone to war, was the entire region about to fall into the hands of communists who, let's put aside the question because we don't have time to discuss it. I mean, those communists may have been far better people than the people we were supporting in Indochina. But let's put that aside. Was the theory itself correct?
Well, the theory itself was clearly wrong, and I think that's generally recognized by historians and observers of the entire Vietnam conflict. But what is more important, I think, or more fundamental than that, is that it was not even believed by the people who were making the argument during the early phase of the Vietnam conflict. It was being used by people who wanted to push the United States into war in order to try to get, first of all, John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson to go to war in Vietnam. And that's one of the things that I discovered in the research that I did in the archives, both the Kennedy and Johnson archives, and reading carefully through the official State Department publication of U.S. documents, that it was in fact not a fundamental belief of those people who were making the arguments, making that argument repeatedly. It was simply an instrumental argument, and by the way, the CIA rejected it repeatedly in the 1950s and again in the 1960s, as late as 1964. They were saying, no, there's not going to be a collapse of non-communist Southeast Asia if we don't fight in South Vietnam. There will be a rise in neutralism. That's going to be the problem that we have to face.
Right. So the entire theory falls apart rather rapidly if you spend the time to examine it.
Exactly.
Okay, last question. let's bring this up to date. Donald Trump and his foreign policy. I find it actually sort of interesting. You know, Trump, I'm not a fan of Trump's. I didn't vote in the last election, and I undoubtedly won't vote in this coming one either, because I don't like I couldn't stand Hillary Clinton. And this time I won't vote because I believe in non-participation as my right to protest a corrupt political system. And in Washington, D.C., my vote as a citizen doesn't matter because it's not counted individually. It's going to be, you know, we have our one electoral college vote, and that's going to go to a Democrat because the district, which I'm proud to live in, is overwhelmingly Democratic. So I choose not to participate. I do vote at the local level, but I will not participate in the scam election we're going to have in 2020. I say this only as a means of emphasizing that I like neither side's foreign policies, with the sides being Democrats and Republicans, and I do not like Trump. And yet I have to say he has done some surprisingly curious things. He is reckless and he is provocative, and he has, you know, done some really dumb, in my view, bombing raids in Afghanistan and Syria that accomplished nothing. He's come very close to going to war in Venezuela, which in my mind is absolutely ludicrous and stupid and would be rejected by the Venezuelan people. I think he's clearly being pushed by people like John Bolton and Elliot Abrams, neoconservatives who, you know, the same geniuses who promoted the Iraq War and said it was going to be a cakewalk. And yet at the same time, he has not gotten the country involved in a major war to date. Now, he's got plenty of time, and especially if he wins re-election, to do so. But just the other day, he said that he called off a bombing raid against Iran that appeared to have been approved by the military, and they were ready to go, or at least that's what Trump claims. And he said, we estimate there will be 150 casualties. That is disproportionate to Iran's alleged shooting down of an unmanned drone. So I called it off. Now, I have to say, whatever I think of Trump, and I don't have a favorable opinion, that's the first time in my memory, and maybe I'm missing something, when a US president walked away at the last minute, certainly, from a military action that, however stupid, would have dramatically increased his popularity because the media would have rallied around the flag and the public, for the most part, would have too, I believe. In any case, that's a big, you know, I just ask you a lot. But, you know, generally, what do you think of Trump's foreign policy? I mean, is it all crap? Is he doing anything right?
Well, first of all, I think you're right that, in fact, you know, his decision on the canceling the strike against Iran is unique in modern presidential decision making on wars. I can't think of a case that is similar to it. So I think that's a very interesting point. And again, of course, I don't like Donald Trump. He's problematic, to say the least, as a personality and as a political leader in so many ways. But let's set aside everything that we both know, and I think your listeners know about what's wrong with Trump. I think what we're seeing here is a phenomenon which is extremely important, and that is that Trump is extremely aware that his constituency, the reason he got elected, is not interested in more wars, and that he must avoid going to war in order to get reelected. And that's a measure of just how much things have changed politically in the country, and specifically with regard to opinions about U.S. wars. And so it's very important to watch this and to do everything possible to encourage that tendency. It is the hope that it's the best hope that we have at this point of change. It looks like.
And that's what's really interesting about what you said is that when you consider, I agree with you. I mean, Trump is, like every president, driven by self-interest. I mean, he does what any other president has done in the past, which is to calculate the odds of it being good for himself or herself. Well, we haven't had a her yet, but hopefully we will. And then, in large measure, acts in the fashion that promotes his own interest. Plus, of course, I mean, I'm oversimplifying. There's always the voice of the Pentagon. In fact, I've been told by pretty good sources that one of the reasons Trump has not actually done the incredibly stupid thing of committing troops to Venezuela to overthrow the government is that the Pentagon war gamed the situation and said this is going to be a disaster. That's single source, let me emphasize, but it's a very good source, and so I believe it's true.
Well, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, obviously it's not merely a question of personal interest. It's, I mean, even Trump, who doesn't listen to as many people as he should, although God knows the people who are around him, and maybe it's good he doesn't listen to them. I mean, it's not as simple as I'm saying, but there is certainly an element of what's best for me in the president's decision-making, any president's decision-making. But what's encouraging is that when you have Trump's base, which, is written off by most of the media and certainly by, knuckleheads like Rachel Maddow and the idiots who idolize her, excuse my language, and just that whole horrible MSNBC culture, they write off, which I think is extraordinarily offensive and wrong, the entire Trump base is a bunch of uneducated hillbillies. And I think that's extraordinarily wrong. And the fact that you're stating, or let's say the theory that you're putting forth, is that the Trump base doesn't want war. And that doesn't jive with what the mainstream media generally assumes about Trump voters. And it is encouraging. And it's good for the country that more people, Republicans, Democrats, independents, everybody, questions whether the U.S. should be committing, I hate to use the old cliche, but blood and treasure.
Right.
You do not want to send young men and women to die unless the country's vital national security interests, not as they are typically defined by U.S. government officials who find our vital national security interests to be everywhere, from Grenada, this country whose whole population would fit in the Rose Bowl back in the 1980s, to Nicaragua, to Iraq, to Iran, to anybody who we feel like invading is suddenly a vital national interest. So I'm glad.
Just to add to what we've been saying, both you and I have been saying, I think the greatest danger that we face is clearly the danger that the Boltons and Pompeos of his administration will continue, as they did during this most recent Iran crisis, to not just make recommendations that are dangerous, but to mislead Trump about the facts that surround the decision. And I'm specifically talking here about the fact that he was being told during the meetings or the key meeting about this issue that there won't be any very many casualties in these strikes because they will do it at night. Now, that is ludicrous for anybody who understands what's really going on here. The Iranians are not going to have sort of understaffed sites for the radars and other targets that they were going to hit. They're going to be fully staffed, just fully through the night as well as during the day. So it doesn't make any difference. That was misleading. That was misleading the president in order to try to get him to carry out the strike.
Yep, that's a really interesting point. And to his credit, nobody ever wants to say this. 80% of the time, 90% of the time, I detest his immigration policies, and I detest what he's doing to people trying to get into this country and to people who are already here and in many cases have been here for decades. I despise his policies. But every once in a while, he does something right. And on the Democratic side, and for the most part, the mainstream media, excluding Fox News, which is, like it or not, mainstream media, it represents a sizable chunk of the population. But for the rest of the media, the guy cannot do anything right. And
One
the
other
media,
point I would make, Ken, on the same point, is that very few people understand that last year, Trump actually reversed what his own administration had put into motion with regard to U.S. policy towards Syria. He wanted to pull the U.S. troops out. And of course, his major advisors, both Pompeo and Bolton, who were very close to the Israelis, did everything possible to undermine that and to get it changed. And they had put into motion a policy that was exactly the opposite during the summer of 2018. But in the end, he once again said no. He turned it down. Now, he's unfortunately has a problem holding on to policies over long periods of time.
yes.
But nevertheless, that was a very interesting exercise in his contradicting his top advisors on Syria.
Right. Well, I would love to continue this conversation, but we're going to have to bring it to a close. I definitely want to have you back on. It's been a pleasure. Really interesting conversation. Everybody should go out and get a copy of The United States, Southeast Asia, and Historical Memory, and read Gareth's chapter. He is a great journalist. And I also have to say, also log on to our website, Washington Babylon. We're going to have upcoming shortly an interview with the editors of that book. And I will immodestly say that we have a small but very intelligent audience, and we provide very, very good coverage of not only foreign policy, but domestic policy. And so check us out too, sign up for our newsletter. And Gareth, once again, thank you for being on today.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
The following has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon, edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBabylon.
It's common to find corrupt members of Congress, but Senator Marco Rubio, really, I can't think of anyone dirtier. Going back to his early days, his brother-in-law, as I recall, was a coke trafficker, and young Marco, as a teenager, used to, as I recall, walk the dogs and mow the lawn of the brother-in-laws. The thing is, you could say, well, he was just the dog walker or the lawnmower, but this was a major coke trafficker, and little Marco never noticed anything funny. I mean, they were dealing a ton of, well, I don't want to say 2,000 pounds. It probably was more. I don't really know. It was a major drug trafficking operation, and little Marco was too goddamn stupid to notice anything, or maybe he did notice something, and they paid him, $100 an hour to walk the dogs. I mean, I can't answer that question, but that's one of the things I'm going to be looking at. There are so many. He has a long-time association with one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida. And when you say one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida, I mean, I don't even know what compares to that. I mean, in the city of New Orleans, I mean, in the city of Chicago, in the outer circles of hell, David Rivera. They are long-time party friends, love to party, love to go out on the town and have a good time, love to consort with lobbyists. He's a family man, so I would not want to cast aspersions on he or Mr. Rivera. However, if one were to do a Google search, one would find some very interesting things. I've written a few things about Mr. Rubio. I won't call him Senator Rubio. That's a degraded term as it is. But this is a guy who, I wrote a story for the New York Observer. Anybody can Google my name, Marco Rubio, and I did a few stories, but one in particular will come up about his real estate transactions, where let's just say he obtained his first house. I think he had 3 houses. I can't remember how many lady friends. Just friends. I mean, I'm not saying they were girlfriends or lovers. I'm just saying they were intimate companions. Good family man. So I wouldn't want to suggest in any way there was more than that. But you can read my New York Observer piece where he declined comment on anything having to do with how he obtained housing, his homes very, 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 very cheaply, and always managed to make money on these real estate transactions where campaign donors or bankers he knew or people who might, again, I don't want to cast aspersions, but people who might want favors from Mr. Rubio helped him out. There was a crooked doctor involved in one of these transactions, a Medicare fraudster. He's got a lot of interesting friends. And he had no comment about this. I mean, if I were called and said, are you a crook? And do you like to party with David Rivera? And do you have some intimate lobbyist female companions? I don't care personally what people do in their private lives, but if you're a U.S. senator, as Mr. Rubio is, a lot of what he does has the appearance of impropriety. So I'll be looking into the dirty, dirty past of this man, but I'll be also focusing on his disgusting role as the chief cheerleader and sponsor of the attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela. I mean, I would say the 3 most powerful individuals all should be rotting in jail cells are Rubio, John Bolton, and Elliot Abrams. And Rubio was there first. I mean, Trump ultimately bears responsibility for the criminal sanctions that are punishing the people of Venezuela, strangling the country, and not harming the leadership. And no question, there is serious corruption among the leadership in the Venezuelan government. I mean, that's not even open to question. However, they're not hurting President Maduro in any way. I understand why the Venezuelan people are tired and exhausted, and they are not happy necessarily with President Maduro. But I have been to Venezuela a few months ago, and I'll be going back as part of my reporting, in addition to going down to Florida. So we very definitely need to raise some money for this story. The situation there, I'm not going to say it's 100% the cause of the United States, but you read newspaper stories where they say the people are starving. Well, the government does give a monthly food basket to everybody in the poor areas, which is most of the country. I saw it with my own eyes and wrote about it at Washington Babylon, Caracas Chronicles. If you Google that and Washington Babylon, you'll find this story. You'll find pictures. I was in the poor areas where I was, fed, well taken care of. I'm not going to say Venezuela is a paradise. Of course it's not. It's a very difficult situation. It's complicated, but if there's any man who is evil in regard to his conduct towards Venezuela, it's Marco Rubio. I mean, you have to sort of wonder, because he's, famously, his family were Cuban fascists, anti-Castro. But I don't know why he's got a hard-on for Venezuela. I mean, and this is one of the things I'll be looking at. Something's there. Maybe he took some dirty money, speculation, of course, from a Venezuelan businessman close to the government and got burned on the deal. I don't know what his obsession is. And lastly, I am also going to be focusing on his best friend in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez, praised in the U.S. media as a hero and a freedom fighter. I can guarantee you this guy is going to look very, very ugly when I'm done with my reporting. His family is extremely rich. They own a lot of property. I don't believe all that property was obtained legally or that they've disclosed the ownership of it. And Leopoldo Lopez is a party goer just like Marco Rubio. Marco used to mow the lawn for coke traffickers. I don't know. I mean, I've just heard stories. It may have just been NyQuil, but, you know, from what I understand, Mr. Lopez, the Trump administration's bitch in Venezuela, and Marco Rubio's God knows what, potentially a business partner, who the hell knows, they are not going to be happy with what I report. That's what I can guarantee you. I can't guarantee you I'll uncover every stone and find every fact, but I will guarantee you that Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and Leopoldo Lopez are going to be pissed off when they see my report. All I'm looking for is $1,200 because I know everybody's pressed for money. That's not even going to cover my costs. I'm looking for money elsewhere. I'm trying to find a sponsor that will pay for my plane ticket to Venezuela. I mean, there's $1,200. You know, the expenses aren't going to come close. I got to go to Florida. I'm happy to do it. It's going to be a great reporting trip. Down to Miami, possibly Tallahassee, and to Caracas. So that's not going to be, you know, at $1,200, I'm going to lose. But I'm going to raise other money, and we'll publish some great stories at Washington Babylon, and I'll probably publish a few stories elsewhere to make money because I got to hustle. Because, as you know, journalism is not the most profitable profession unless you are, well, like a lot of our U.S. journalists, not terribly critical or skeptical or honest. And that's, you know, the fastest route to success. But we try to do a little bit better at Washington Babylon.
Preceding has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon, edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. Music credits are as follows. The songs Hacienda and Akari were produced and distributed by the website Filmstro, while The Internationale was produced by Jerry Engelbach. All music has been used in this package on the basis of properly recognized and adhered to licenses with their creators. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBabylon. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.